Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at Survivor's 6th season, Survivor the Amazon. In the 20th anniversary special, Survivor at 40, this season is completely omitted from Survivor's history, even though this season is constantly ranked in the top 10 of best Survivor seasons. But, do I personally agree with the top 10 ranking myself? Does this season deserve to be seen, or does it deserve to be forgotten because it aired back in 2003? So as of the recording of this episode, that would be 17 years ago. Now, before we really get into it, if you want to stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, regardless if I upload the YouTube, BitChute, LBRY, wherever, then follow the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com. The link will be below in the description. So with that out of the way, let's get into Survivor the Amazon. Now, as always, we're going to start off talking about the twists, and the biggest twist, and really the only twist this season, was the fact that this season was a battle of the sexes. A tribe of 8 men and a tribe of 8 women. Now, normally I don't like Battle of the Sexes, but I did actually like it for this season. I feel that this twist works well with the location, since the Amazon did have tribes of all women when the Spanish were coming through and conquering the land. And I believe that this is the first time that Survivor has ever had a twist that really played to its location, making the location more important instead of just the place where they just happened to be that year. And this would be the only twist, like I said, this would be the only twist of the game this season. Yes, there was a tribe swap, but this isn't the first season to ever have a tribe swap. The first season for that would have been Survivor Africa. So now with the twists out of the way, let's get into the cast assessment, and we're going to start with the Tambaki tribe, and that was the men's tribe. And we're going to start with Ryan, since he was the first boot. And if you've been watching these Survivor retrospectives, you know that I don't give too much thought to first boots of a season. Because, once they're there and you blink and they're gone. And then, then let's move on to Daniel. And I mean, other than him speaking Mandarin, I don't really remember much about him. I think he was like the third person voted off. Then we get to Alex, who was basically the frat bro, the dude that obviously is in a fraternity of the season, if you know what I mean. This is especially shown during the first individual immunity challenge that we'll get to just a little later. Then we have Dave. Now, he was the rocket scientist who was responsible for getting Gene out in the Premerge. Then we have Matthew. He was the guy who really didn't play the game but had the survival skills necessary to make it in the jungle. And I personally believe that that's more important than being everyone's best friend, if I'm being 100% honest. Then we have Roger, and he's an old school guy, probably cast to be the next Rudy Bosch. But what didn't help him was the perception that he made for himself, because someone like Rudy could get away with what he said, since Rudy was 72 and ex-military when he played. Roger was in his mid to late 50s, so yes, a little older, but not really old enough to get away with the views that he held. And it wasn't enough to just write him off as, oh, he's just the crotchety old man, stuck in his ways, whatever, we'll move on. Then we have Butch, and he was the school principal. Now, most people will probably remember him as the guy who was responsible for burning the shelter down in the Postmerge with all the firewood he had gathered and built up, basically the inferno waiting to happen. And finally, we get to the most famous of the male players this season, and that's Rob Cesternino, yes, the podcaster. And I feel that he's more known as the podcaster and not really a Survivor player. He was the guy that started all of the alliance flipping to keep himself in the majority. And we even see that style of play, play out into today. And not to drag this out longer than it needs to be, but he is a part of the foundation for these modern Survivor players in terms of strategy. So now let's move on to the LBRY tribe, and that was the tribe of all women. And we're going to start off with Janet. She was the one that was voted out because everyone thought that she had smuggled in a granola bar at the time. And really, who knows if this is true, but this isn't the first allegation of someone smuggling something into the game. And the earliest I can think of is Kel from Australian Outback, when he was accused of smuggling in beef jerky. Then we have Joanna, and to me, her shtick got real old real fast. She was the one that had to bring the gospel into the camp. Now, there's been religious people in the prior seasons, and even seasons long after this, but it was usually just a group prayer or whatnot, and that was it. Praise God, amen, whatever. Now, there's an old saying that a colleague of mine told me back in high school. Religion is like a penis. If you have one, then great. But if you show it off to the world, then be prepared for anything that can and will be thrown at you. Then we move on to Shauna. Now, most of the men's tribe pegged her as the hottest girl for the season. She was the one that got depressed and wanted to quit the game until the swap happened when the men finally came over. Now, I can see how she went from depression to uplifting when men finally walked into the camp. You finally get members of the opposite sex, and you're just going, oh, thank God, now I don't have to deal with just all men or all women, all this, drama bullshit, or all these dude bros just butting a bunch of heads. Then we have Dina, and she was the attorney that was on this season. Now, I would say that she was the doppelganger for Rob C, just based on the fact that she was, the one calling the shots in the pre-merge at one point. Then her and Rob were working together in the post-merge for a short amount of time before he inevitably voted her off. Then we get to Jean, and she was another one of those hard workers, and everyone else is just sitting around doing nothing. So if we're comparing it to older seasons, she was basically the female BB for this season. Then we have Jenna, and she was the youngest to play the game at that time at the age of 21. Now, most people remember her for being one of the girls that stripped for chocolate and peanut butter. And speaking of the girls who stripped for chocolate and peanut butter, we have Heidi, who was the other one that did that. Now, she was the most athletic on the girls' side, and I would really hope that she was more athletic than most of the others, given that she was a gym teacher at the time, according to her bio. And finally, we get to Christy, and she was the first deaf person to ever play the game, and she got very far, I think getting 6th for someone who really can't play that much of a social game. Given the disability, but she could rough it in the jungle given that she was a nature guide before going out there, so she probably knew what berries you could eat and which ones would probably fuck you up. Now that we're done talking about the cast, let's move on to the actual gameplay portion of this retrospective, and as always, we start with the pre-merge. Now, there isn't a whole lot that goes on in the pre-merge if I'm being completely honest here, so basically, it's just a standard pre-merge, and it is fun to look at it as a battle of the sexes. The people that were most affected by this twist were Shauna, Jenna, and Heidi. Now, they were affected by it for one simple reason, and that's simply because they just couldn't utilize their assets. If they try to utilize their assets on other women, they probably would have been the first ones voted off because, other women take offense to it. Now, once the swap happened, they could finally start flaunting their assets to stay in the game. And I hope anyone who listens to me is smart enough to put 2 and 2 together to know what assets that I'm talking about. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And then the Battle of the Sexes was officially over at the Final 12 when the swap happened. Now, the swap was handled the same way as in Thailand in terms of picking the tribes. In Thailand, it was the oldest man and oldest woman picked the 2 tribes, but in the Amazon, it was the youngest man and youngest woman that picked the tribes for the swap. And if we're looking at the actual Battle of the Sexes portion of the game pre-swap, it was pretty even when it came for the immunities, in the sense that 2 men and 2 women were voted out pre-swap. Now let's move on to the post-merge, and this is where the memorable moments from the season are. The first one being the first individual immunity challenge where Jenna and Heidi stripped for chocolate and peanut butter. Every Survivor fan knows of this moment. Yes, it's that iconic. You have Rob C basically booming out, "Give the girls some chocolate and peanut butter, probes!" And then there's Alex basically smiling and giving the thumbs up, acting like a total, dude fucking frat bro. Now, once Jenna and Heidi jump into the water and swim over to the boat to claim the chocolate and peanut butter, everybody just, goes, they've earned their reward. And if we're looking at the gameplay, this is where the season becomes unpredictable, and it's unpredictable in a good way. Dina thinks that she's safe during the eating challenge and gives up immunity to Matt. Dina gets voted out that night. Christy thinks that she's in the driver's seat for the vote at Final 6. She gets voted out that night. Rob C flips on the majority alliance of himself, Jenna, Heidi, and Alex to vote Alex out. If Marquesas was the first season to show a power shift in the post-merge, then this was the first season to show someone who flipped on alliances to always remain in the majority. And I started with a memorable moment in this section, so I'll end it with the other memorable moment from the season, and it was the camp burning down to the ground as a result of all the firewood scattered throughout the camp. Now, we've seen a camp be destroyed before. It happened in Australian Outback, where the camp washed away as a result of being in a dry creek bed post-merge, but we've never actually seen a camp burn to the ground before this, and there's only been one other time when that's happened, and that wouldn't be until Season 21. That's Survivor Nicaragua. Now let's move on and talk about, the final 2 and inevitably the winner. And we'll start off with the winner. That would be Jenna Maraska. She would go on to be the winner of the season. Now, I know that people will point to the fact that she wanted to quit at Final 5, But if a game is that physically and mentally taxing, then I would believe that every one of you would be in the same position. Now, I feel that she made some brilliant gameplay moves that no one really gives her credit for, even to this day. There's two that I would like to point out. The first being the stripping for chocolate and peanut butter at the first individual immunity challenge. Yes, it's an iconic moment, but let's look at this from a gameplay perspective. There were 6 men versus 4 women going into the merge. Her and Heidi stripping and wooing the men in the process by showing their assets bought them more life in the game, in my opinion. Yes, it was great TV, and they made some money off of it with their Playboy spread, but it was also gameplay. It was pure strategy for them to not get voted off earlier into the merge. And the second move I want to point out was Jenna giving up the immunity necklace to Heidi at Final 6. Now, she claimed it was strategy, and most people watching Survivor today would say that that's a bullshit answer and that someone just wants to quit the game and blah, blah, blah. Now, I personally believe that it was strategy because she knew that Rob Cesternino couldn't turn on her at that point in the game at that moment. Rob had to vote Christy out at that point. If Rob had betrayed Jenna again, then it would have been used against him if he made it to Final 2, and he probably wouldn't even have a shot at winning the game back then. Now, one of two things could have happened after Jenna giving up that immunity necklace. Either Rob sticks with the plan to vote out Christy, or he votes out Jenna and exposes himself to be the snake at the time. What does Rob do in that situation? If he wants to win, he does the former. If he wants to lose, he does the latter. And finally, let's move on to the runner-up, and that was Matt. Now, I don't know if he should have won over Jenna, to be completely honest. He really didn't play the game, but he had the survival skills to really rough it in the jungle. And in my opinion, on a game show called Survivor that has an element of surviving the elements, survival skills are just as important as social skills. He was the man who caught a lot of fish. Without him, everyone else wouldn't have ate. What's more important? Man hunts food and brings that back to tribe. Or, man is everyone's best friend, but everyone's starving. I would argue the former over the latter, but that's just my opinion. Keep in mind, I have personally never shed blood in this arena, so what the fuck do I know? I'm merely just an outside observer, if I'm being 100% honest. Now let's move on to talk about the reunion, and I'm not going to stay on this topic for very long. The reunion was a normal reunion. I stated in my Thailand retrospective that a reunion will not make or break a season typically. If a season is bad, then the reunion will not just magically make it better. And I still think that Probst is not the right guy to host these because you can see him struggle with the questions and even the responses to the castaways up on stage. Yeah, he's the host of the show, but you have to remember that those tribal councils are heavily edited. And this would be the first reunion of many to be held at the Ed Sullivan Theater in New York City. That's where David Letterman filmed for years. Now, Survivor after this would alternate between Los Angeles and New York for their reunions before just settling on Los Angeles for the past few years, recently as of the recording of this episode. This season was met with a positive reception at the time when it initially aired on CBS and is still considered a top 10 season to this day, and I personally can see why. I believe that there's enough people in this cast to carry it all the way through. This is one of those rare seasons where truly the weakest people go out in the pre-merge that make it an exciting post-merge. And I know that people call Jenna one of the most spoiled winners, but this season is a case where the winner doesn't really matter. If a season is really that good, whoever wins doesn't really make or break a season. There are exceptions to that rule. It's usually the editing that makes or breaks a season. And this is also one of those rare seasons where I actually like more of the women players than I like the men. And yes, I do believe that Jenna Maraska is an underrated winner. I believe that a lot of people don't like her as a winner just simply because she was 21 when she won the game. Yes, she played like a young, hot 21-year-old girl, but be honest, you would do the exact same if you were in that position. If you had those assets that she had, a 21-year-old, swimsuit model that every guy wants to probably be with, you would probably use that to your advantage. And before I drag this out for too long, I'll end the episode off with this. I believe that you are doing yourself a disservice if you refuse to watch this season. If you're a modern Survivor fan, this season is a part of the foundation for the show that you are currently watching today. Rob Cesternino is part of the foundation for modern Survivor strategy. If we're not looking at gameplay, let's also look at the fact that during the post-merge, it wasn't just one shelter that was built. There was a main shelter, a secondary shelter, a fire shelter, and later a shelter for the firewood. And that wasn't a camp. That was a small fucking village. Also, there are some iconic moments from Survivor's history that happened this season, whether it's Jenna and Heidi stripping for chocolate and peanut butter, or Jenna giving up immunity and not being voted out as a result. And as of the recording of this episode, she is the only one to willingly give up immunity and not be voted out as a result of that move. And I feel that even the production team at Survivor really did this season a disservice by not even mentioning it in their 20th anniversary special, Survivor at 40, for every reason that I listed before this. This season, in my opinion, is too iconic to simply be ignored.